you very much for the introduction, and all of you for the kind words. I feel humbled as well as happy to be here. Humbled because of the name of the K.A. Center for Quranic Studies. And as Intisham indicated, in one sense I come back to Aligarh, and I always come back here privileged and blessed with the example and instruction of Professor K.A. Nizami. When I first came to Aligarh, I should just say, in a bit of humor, it was 1972, and I intended just to see Aligarh because I'd heard of it, and then to pass by and go see other places, of course, Delhi, and then Hyderabad, and Calcutta. And I sat in the office of Professor Nizami, and he said, "You will come back here." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "It is my prayer, and it will be your wish." And he was right. So I'm glad that both his prayers and wishes have been answered and that I've come back here. But I must say, I still have one homework assignment from him that remains incomplete. And so before I talk about Yusuf Ali, I must tell you about my delinquency. Professor Nizami made me pledge that I would translate the Fuad to Fuad. I tried, and some people think that there's a modest success in that effort. But I should confess that I have tried, and so far not succeeded, in finishing the translation of Akhbar Akhbar fi Asar Aligarh by Sheikh Abdul Haq Muhammad. And I can only say it's a longer book, it's a tougher book, and I miss his daily inspiration for doing it, but I hope, if God grants me, that I will have the time and the patience to see also that translation through. And thank you, Intisham, for your remarks. And I should say also I'm happy to have met Ahmad Ali, because his older brother, Yusuf Ali, Dr. Yusuf Ali, is a very good friend of mine from Delhi. And of course, I'm very much indebted to Vice Chancellor Sanuddin Shah, because I know after yesterday's convocation, he would much rather be playing golf than listening to me today. So thank you for your presence, as also for your sacrifice in general. So, in what I say, let me give you an indication. There will be 5 parts to what I'm going to say. There will be an opening anecdote. It will be short. Then there will be some questions about translation. That will be also fairly short. Then there will be observation about current translations of the Holy Quran. And then a 4th part will look at Muslim rivals to Yusuf Ali's translation. And the final and the only long part of my talk, it will probably be 10 minutes, will be the saga, what I call the saga of Yusuf Ali's translation. The opening anecdote. It was almost 2 years ago, March 2011, I found myself in South Africa. I had been invited to give a paper at the annual conference of the Rasuli Center, located in Pretoria, and run by the tireless Sufi Sheikh Fadlallah Ali. The theme of that conference in 2011 was the original meaning of sacred messages. The Holy Quran was the principal, but not sole focus of 8 presentations given. My own was titled Sacred Messages, Allowance for Change in Language, Culture, and Circumstance. And before I got up to speak, as before I got up to speak today, there was a recitation from the Holy Quran. And I was moved by the tone of the reciter's voice, as also by his articulation of each subset of the surah he recited. I was so moved, in fact, that before I launched into my own paper, I commented on the extraordinary quality of that recitation. I observed publicly, it is one of my favorite surahs, Surah Al-Duha, the glorious morning light. So I could just be giving what I just heard today as a wonderful also recitation. So it's as if I have an echo today of what I heard in South Africa 2 years ago. And I could claim that Intisham planned it, but I will credit Allah Ta'ala for having made this possible. That I get to open my talk and have it as a humble response to the wonderful recitation of the Noble Quran, which I hear before. But in South Africa, it was rather strange, because at the end of my talk, someone approached me. He was a judge, John Murphy. He was a middle-aged, white South African. "Can we have dinner?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. And then he added, "I need to talk to you about that opening Quranic recitation." But why, I asked myself, did this esteemed judge, who was a member of the Pretoria High Court, want to discuss the Quran recitation with me? I had not recited it, and apart from that opening remark, unlike the paper you're going to hear today, I made no reference at all to the 93rd surah of the Quran in the entire 45-minute paper. So I was curious, and it turned out the judge's interest had been piqued by my simple comment, "It is one of my favorite surahs, Surah Al-Duha, the glorious morning light." The glorious morning light, as I learned over dinner, was also the judge's favorite surah. More than that, it was the surah that had brought him to Islam. And as he told me the story of his conversion, his hands moved as if he were reliving and hearing for the first time the series of questions and commands that mark the final verses of this short 11-verse Quranic surah. "They speak to me," he whispered. "They speak to me as they once spoke to and comforted the Prophet, peace be upon him. They address not just the life of the Prophet Muhammad, an orphan and a seeker. They go beyond his circumstance to touch all humanity." And then Judge Murphy recited to me the entire surah, not in Arabic, but from the translation by Abdullah Yusuf Ali. Surah 93, Al-Duha, the glorious morning light. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. By the glorious morning light, and by the night when it is still, thy guardian Lord hath not forsaken thee, nor is he displeased. And verily the hereafter will be better for thee than the present. And soon will thy guardian Lord give thee that wherewith thou shalt be well pleased. And then with a pause. Did he not find thee an orphan and give thee shelter and care? And he found thee wandering, and he gave thee guidance? And he found thee in need and made thee independent? Therefore, treat not the orphan with harshness, nor repulse the petitioner unheard, but the bounty of thy Lord rehearse and proclaim. Somebody's cell phone is telling them that they should listen more carefully to this recitation. And we pause after the judge's recitation of the surah, absorbing the force and beauty of its interlocking queries and demands. And we then began to talk. We shared much of our parallel spiritual journeys, though he was Muslim and I was not. We did differ on one major point. Judge Murphy knew no literary Arabic. Of course, he had learned enough Arabic to perform salat once he embraced Islam, but he had been innocent of any Arabic before that day when he heard the glorious morning light, Yusuf Ali's rendition of Surah Al-Duha. At once he liked it. He felt a connection to its message. He then memorized its 11 verses before beginning his own journey toward Islam, guided only by the memory and the hope of that English translation of Surah Al-Duha. At one point, during our hour-long dinner conversation, we were hurrying to finish up because we were going to attend a Sufi zikr which followed. Judge Murphy wondered out loud to me, "Could I be saved," he asked, "through the Quran? Will my faith be sufficient since it speaks not of the Arabic Quran, but of the English Koran?" It was a question that he had long pondered, and now sincerely, intently, he shared his concern with me. "Is not my faith second tier?" he continued. "Am I not lacking at a fundamental level because I do not know the original language, the lyrical Arabic of the noble Quran?" There followed an uncomfortable silence. I could not and did not answer his heartfelt query. Since I am a tender of ideas, not a reader of souls, I could not speak to the status of his soul in the hereafter. Who can? Allahu A'lam bis-sawab. God alone knows what is true. What I could do, and try to do, is to register both the passion and the pathos of this 21st century South African Anglo-Irish Muslim judge. In a very real sense, today's lecture is a delayed answer to the poignant questions raised by Judge John Murphy at that evening meal 2 years ago in Pretoria. It is also a commentary on the amazing insight from the Zaman Said Nursi in the Saleh Nur, where he writes, "As time grows old, Al-Quran grows young. Its signs become more apparent. As time grows old, Al-Quran grows young. Its signs become more apparent." And so my central query today, how does Al-Quran grow young? Are its signs perhaps becoming more apparent in this century, the 21st century, than previous times? And if so, I'd like to suggest that one measure of the youth of the Quran is its adaptability to languages other than Arabic. But if the resilience and subtlety of Al-Quran is enhanced today through the Quran, it must begin with assessing Yusuf Ali's translation. There are other competitors for the best English rendition of the noble book, but I will argue that none has achieved the status of above Yusuf Ali. But first, I will do it by looking at whether translation or translatability is even possible. This is a well-worn path. Many have asserted not only that the Quranic revelation is distinct from all predecessors, but also that the Arabic Quran, shall we say, is a fortress. It is a fortress that must be protected, shored up, and defended, because it and only it can project the truth of the transcendent one, Allah Ta'ala. Yes, although the divine is at once eternal, universal, encompassing all periods, places, and languages, it is the case, some have argued, that ever since the early 7th century, only in Arabic, and only in the Arabic of the Holy Quran, can the divine presence and message be mediated. If this argument is upheld, then we cannot, indeed we should not, translate the Quran either into English or any other language. We also cannot or should not translate Allah into Hoda or God or any other language. But there are historical problems in denying the possibility or the viability of translating the Quran. Many studies have been devoted to it, but now, just recently, the topic has been amplified by Professor Sadeh. He has published last year from Oxford Press a book entitled The Vernacular Quran, and it's subtitled Translation and the Rise of Persian Exegesis. The Vernacular Quran, Translation and the Rise of Persian Exegesis, the Tafsir. In this book, Professor Zadeh looks at the orality, the spokenness, and the interlinear renditions of the noble book, especially among Ajami, or Persian-speaking Muslims. At one point, further into this book, Professor Zadeh examines the Takbir, as you know, the proclamation of Allahu Akbar, as understood by Persian Muslims in Salah. And he quotes Imam Ghazali. And these are quotations which I'm editing from both Ihya and Kiyah. Where Ghazali addresses the issue of tadabbur to the Quran. That is, how does one ponder the meaning of Quran in the process of praying words that are related to it and taken from it. Observe Imam Ghazali, all the words to be recited in Salah must be understood, and it must be understood, not just spoken but understood. And of course, the Ajami Muslim understands the meaning of Allahu Akbar as Khuday Hujjatai. Yet there remains the further debate beyond the takbir or orality of the Quran of whether or not the name Allah can or should be translated in manuscript or print versions of the noble book. And there are two opposite answers, and I want to just share those with you. The first comes from Dr. Hussein Abdul. He is a linguistic scholar. He has examined elements of discourse, texture, exegesis in his book, Quran Translation. And at one point, Dr. Abdul in this book says, you cannot translate Allah. And he argues as follows. The very concept of Allah, sometimes people try to translate as God, but it needs to be explained to the target language reader in advance. For at the very beginning of any translation of the Quran, one must avoid any possible wrong presuppositions and not get mixed up with the concept of God in other religions. It is preferable not to translate Allah. On the other side is Abdullah Sa'id. He is perhaps one of the most prominent of those who argue about Quranic complexities in context. Professor Sa'id makes the opposite argument of Dr. Abdul. In his book, Interpreting the Quran, Dr. Sa'id pairs Quranic references to God with Quranic references to paradise. And here's what he says. Most of the references in the Quran are to God, but there also are references about paradise. How does one interpret a verse related to paradise? The first step is to understand the meaning of the word in our everyday language. In projecting our idea of paradise onto the unseen world, we use popular, religious, historical narratives. We also use our imagination. In the end, what we imagine as paradise is only our imagination. Whatever meaning we give to paradise, it remains a human construct, a product of human imagination. And then he goes on to say, in a similar way, the interpreter does not know what God is like. There is no normal correspondence between the interpreter's understanding of God and what God actually is. The Quran refers to this several times, but no more strongly than in Surah Shura, in verse 11, which ends, "Laysa kamithlihi shay'un." There is not like him anything. This type of text, observes Professor Sa'id, the meaning we arrive at when we use the word God and the reality which it refers do not correspond. We always must be content with approximate meanings conveyed through images borrowed from human experience. To summarize, Professor Sa'id is arguing that since we cannot know either God or Allah, the choice between names is a matter of cultural preference, not metaphysical correctness. But he also acknowledges equally that Quranic references to God, like all other parts of the Noble Book, do have meaning. That is why they were revealed. That's also why the Holy Quran stands at the summit of all revelation given to human beings for guidance. And so there must be a search intense and endless, for what are the meanings in the Noble Book, and how these meanings are to be understood in each historical and contemporary context. Whether it is Allah, Khulda, or God, all these names share the property of connection to truth, but equidistance from the source of all truth. What the Algerian philosopher David Ben-Abi called the absolute metaphysical intelligence, beyond all that we think or say or imagine. It is also beyond what we human beings construct, interpret, and project as true. I'm quoting from both the Arabic and the French of Ben-Abi, but I'll spare you that and just give you the English. In a sense, the argument of Professor Sa'id serves to restate, but also update, the argument that is again found in Imam al-Ghazali in his book Qanun al-Ta'wil, the canon of interpretation. There, Imam Ghazali argues that both rational or symbolic and literal or physical interpretations of Quranic dicta are possible. In other words, he doesn't say you must do it one way or the other. He says both a literal, physical, and a rational or symbolic interpretation are possible of some verses. The obstacle for us as human beings is the danger of premature closure, of deciding too quickly we know what it means. And here are the words from Imam Ghazali from Qanun al-Ta'wil. One must refrain, he observes, from specifying one interpretation when various interpretations are incompatible. Judgment concerning God's intent or the intent of his prophet, peace be upon him, by means of either supposition or guessing is dangerous. One knows the intention of the speaker only when he reveals his intention. If he does not reveal his intention, how can one know it? Unless the possibilities are limited, as they are in some verses, and all but one is eliminated, then and only then can one assume that the intention is understood. The various possibilities in the speech of Arabs and the ways of expanding upon them are many, so how can they be limited? In approaching the Quran, it is better to refrain from advocacy of one interpretation over all others. It is safer to allow all and allow God to make a judgment as to what is correct. Let me be clear here. I'm not advocating either Professor Said or Imam Ghazali as the only true guides for understanding the Quran in translation, or Abdullah Yusuf Ali in particular. But what I am suggesting is that both the renowned scholar of the medieval period and a very important scholar of the present era allow for a much broader sense of engagement with meanings and expressions of the Holy Quran than the opposite approach, which I should restate. The opposite approach is to admit that the Arabic is exceptional and also exclusive, and that Arabic alone is the index of divine truth and revelatory intent in the Holy Quran. If, as Nursi, the Diaz-Imam Saud Nursi declared, the Quran is perpetually young, then one possible channel of its youthful vitality may in fact be its repackaging in English. And as you heard in the opening remark when I was introduced, we were talking about Yusuf Ali, in the very introduction of his own translation, he says, one of the purposes of my translation is to make English itself an Islamic language. So how do we assess Yusuf Ali? I am indebted here to Professor A.R. Kidby, who has shared with me some of his own work on this subject. And I'd like to say that it has been expanded, the difficulty of looking at all the translations of the noble book into English. It has been expanded in the last 15 to 20 years because of this thing which all of our children know better than us. It's called the computer, it's called the iPhone, it's called the web, and the World Wide Web has now made all the ubiquitous translations of the Quran. I was, in fact, I should say, I was someplace else recently, and I was talking with a group of students who, none of them were Muslim and none of them knew Arabic, but they all said, oh, we have so many versions of the Quran, and they just showed all these things, just flashed it one after another on me, and I was dizzy. I was dazed by the time I got done. So I said, how do you pick from them? And they said, well, we're tired. Well, I said that you have to have a better criteria than fatigue to decide which of several translations of the Quran in English is preferable. And Dr. Kidby, in his article first and then his 2007 book, which he shared with me, talks about the Quran as translating the untranslatable. And in one sense, I agree with him, but I also agree that one has to then think about those who try to translate the untranslatable and to judge who has done it better and who has done it worse. Today, in 2013, there is a new book that will be coming out in about 2 months from England called The Quran, an Annotated Translation. And this person, like everybody who's translated, says his, mine, this is the best. And he does so by saying, here are all the major translations. And he lists the following. Some of you know them, or some of you know most of them, some of you may not know a few of them. But he says, of course, there's Muhammad al-Halim, the Quran, which came out from Oxford 2004. There's Ahmed Ali, the Quran, a contemporary translation, Princeton, 1988. There's, of course, A.J. Arbery, the Quran Interpreted, which came out from London, 1955. There's one which, for lack of time, I don't deal with today, but I have elsewhere, Muhammad Asad, The Message of the Quran, which came out in 1980. Richard Bell, which is a very old one, but it was published in 1937, but recently reprinted from Oxford in 2009. There's Majid Fakhri, a very interesting translation of the Quran, a modern English version, came out in 1996. There's the Alan Don, who spent 30 years teaching Arabic, and only when he retired translated the Quran. That's Alan Jones, and his translation came out in 2007. Then there's the Lebanese scholar, also a linguist, Tali Khalidi, the Quran, a new translation, came out from Penguin in 2008. And then the list comes finally down to two golden oldies. Muhammad Pickthall, The Meaning of the Glorious Quran, which came out in 1930, and then, of course, the one we're dealing with today of W. Yusuf Ali, the Holy Quran, text, translation, commentary, 1934 to 1937 from Lahore, from Sheikh Muhammad Ashraf. Now, all of these translations rely on English language as a resource for disclosing layers of meaning in the Quran. And several commentators have reviewed and criticized that. But one of the things that is often neglected in these criticisms is how well the translator matches Quranic idiom with the rhythm, the pace, what Yusuf Ali calls the music and tone of English. Of course we know the meaning and rhythm and tone of Arabic, but how do you account for the rhythm and tone and meaning of English? In my view, each of these efforts, the ones I just cited, hinge on a prior decision about whether some words are translatable, and of all the words that can be translated, the one that raises the highest stakes when looking at the noble book, the Holy Quran, is Allah Ta'ala. And the strategy for translation is always a moving target. Every translator, and this includes Yusuf Ali, is compelled to favor either the original source, Arabic, or the intended audience, which in this case is not Arabic-speaking, but English-speaking. Not only is there no such thing as an objective translation of the Holy Quran, but there also are specific translations produced by scholars with a wide set of worldviews, including some that are not explicitly Muslim. So let me just finish this overview and come to Yusuf Ali and say that if the target language is English, and the target audience, native speakers of English, one cannot appraise the contribution of Yusuf Ali without also examining him and comparing him with others. And among those non-Muslim others, I would hold up two, one of which you've heard of, the other which you've not heard of, but I'll introduce them to you briefly today. The one you've heard of, the one I just mentioned, was A.J. Arbery, but the other one is more recent, whose translation only came out in 2006, is Thomas Cleary, a Buddhist monk who worked with an Arabic translator for 5 years and produced a rendering called the Quran, which in poetry is one of the ones that's most highly regarded in some circles today. So A.J. Arbery and Thomas Cleary are two more modern, non-Muslim translations of the Quran. And I cite them a little bit in what follows, but I mostly look at Abdullah Yusuf Ali. And I want to say before I look again at Surah Al-Duha, that what has to say about Yusuf Ali before anything else, a respect for his dedication to the Holy Book, and every time his name is cited or quoted, one must remember what was said also in the introduction to my talk today, that pervading and guiding his labor is something which he calls the larger spirit of inclusivism, and he derives inclusivism from the Quran itself. So despite the critiques, and I share some of them, I've made some others of my own, critiques of Yusuf Ali, whether it's doctrinal, literary, major, quibbling, I think one must always quickly add, don't forget the generosity of purpose that motivates his translation and still excites many readers, scholars, and believers, and not just judges from South Africa, although they also have their place in evaluating the success of his translation. So let me look at Surah Al-Duha. Just briefly, this is the heart of my talk. Muslim rivals to Yusuf Ali, everybody would say Pickthall, of course. And you've heard now the translation which Yusuf Ali gave of Surah Al-Duha. And now I read to you the one from Muhammad Pickthall. He titles The Morning Hours. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. By the morning hours, and by the night when it is stillest, thy Lord hath not forsaken thee, nor doth he hate thee. And verily the latter portion will be better for thee than the former. And verily thy Lord will give unto thee so that thou wilt be content. Did not find thee an orphan, and protect thee. Did not find thee wandering, and direct thee. Did not find thee destitute, and enrich thee. Again, a pause. Therefore the orphan oppress not. Therefore the beggar drive not away. Therefore of the bounty of thy Lord be thy discourse. From orphan to family, from poverty to comfort, from uncertainty to guidance. But at the same time, one must recall that this surah was revealed to him at a time when the outcome of his life journey and the fate of his struggling community was not clear. In other words, it was a very early revelation. But 3 directives are given to him: not oppress the beggar, not oppress the orphan, not dismiss the beggar, but most importantly, because it comes last, and it comes in a single word, do not neglect to remember and proclaim the benefit or bounty of thy Lord. So in every instance, what we find out, whether we look at Pickthall or we look at Yusuf Ali, the compactness of the Arabic has to be unpacked in English. And in my humble view, while Yusuf Ali succeeds, Pickthall stumbles. You can't see it because I don't have I'm set up to use a screen, but you can see he uses parenthetical Ds after each one of the directives and the response. But you've heard the last one, hadith. Hadith becomes, from Pickthall, therefore of the bounty of thy Lord be thy discourse. He changes a verb into a noun. And he loses the music, the tone, and in my view, the emphasis of the Arabic. And let's look at Aligarh. This is how Aligarh translates those last 6 lines. Did he not find the orphan and shelter thee? Did he not find the erring and guide thee? Did he not find the needy and suffice thee? I don't like that suffice thee. That's okay. Pause. Ask for the orphan, do not oppress him. And as for the beggar, scold him not. And as for thy Lord's blessing, declare it. Now there are some, especially the well-known scholar Yusuf Ali from McGill in Canada, who commends Aligarh's work as the best that's ever been done in English, better than Yusuf Ali, because of his equal attention to aesthetic and rhetorical features of the Holy Quran. But I would argue, at least in this surah, and by the way, I have other examples in other surahs, but out of time, I'm not going to give them to you today, where I think he overplays it. That is to say, Aligarh tries too hard to give a kind of what Emery Shulman used to call a mystic lullaby in English that doesn't quite reflect the intensity of the original Arabic. And by contrast, here is Thomas Cleary, the most recent of what I consider to be the formidable and productive translations of the noble book in English. This is Thomas Cleary on the same set of questions and answers from Surah Al-Duha. Did God not find you orphaned and provide you refuge? Find you wandering and guide you? Find you needy and enrich you? So do not oppress the orphan, or refuse the one who seeks, and tell of the bounty of your Lord. So Cleary's language is compressed, almost as compressed as the original Arabic. But I would argue that it still breaks up the reflexive connection of divine care to divine repair, so that God both knew and responded to the prophet's serial despair, but is lost a bit in the intensity of that. And finally, let me give you what I think is the one translation which I would not only compare with Yusuf Ali, but I would say is equal to it in its intensity, and both in its aesthetic and rhetorical, and also its accuracy, its accommodating and reflecting the original Arabic. This comes from somebody most of you have not heard of, at least as a Quran translator. His name is Shaukat Turaba. He's a linguist, like Abu. He's a professor. And this is the catch. He's also a college imam. That is to say, he has to take care of young people. He would be in that capacity if he were here at AMU. But he happens to be at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And here is how Professor Turaba approaches the challenge of translating Surah Al-Duha. He also calls it the morning light. And then he goes, in the name of God, full of compassion, ever compassionate. By the morning light, and by the darkening night. Your Lord has not forsaken you, there is no slight. The hereafter is far better for you than this first light. Your Lord will lavish bounties on you, and you will know delight. And now the questions and answers. Did he not find you orphan, then give you respite? Find you unaware, then guide you aright? Find you wanting, and then provide? And the answers. So as for the orphan, do not oppress. So as for the supplicant, do not suppress. and as for the bounty of your Lord, proclaim it abroad. I think actually that like clearly Turalo uses breaks to interrupt but also connect the different parts of the Quran. And it's exactly at the end that he comes up with something which I think is his strongest contribution in translating the Hadith. He doesn't do just one word. He realizes, as Yusuf Ali and his genius recognize, that sometimes in Arabic, to even come close to the music, you must expand. So while Yusuf Ali said, rehearse and proclaim, Tilawah echoes him in saying, proclaim it abroad. Never before. So in my view, Tilawas, Shafa Tilawas, is the best endeavor, not just for Surah Al-Duha, but for other surahs of the Holy Quran. But he is always working with, and as is his background, the earlier translation of Abdullah Yusuf Ali. So finally, and this is the end of my remarks today, I want to say something about what happened to the translation of Yusuf Ali. I have used it myself in many connections that I won't elaborate, all of which have been beneficial. But I've constantly been surprised when I now try and go to the internet, and I tell some of my students to go to the internet and find Yusuf Ali, and what they give me back is not the Yusuf Ali I read. And it's not the Yusuf Ali that Yusuf Ali produced. It's something else. And what is this something else that one finds when one looks under Yusuf Ali and tries to find the Holy Quran in his translation as text and commentary? As was said earlier, he produced it in 34-37, but in 1993, there appeared a new Saudi authorized version. And in between, there were several other stops, which I'll skip telling you about, but the one that was Saudi authorized, which has become one of the most popular bestsellers from a company called Amana Publications in America, was reprinted in 1977. It's now in its 4th edition, and that is in its 11th printing, and it still tops all the bestseller lists, if you look on Amazon or anything, of all translations of the Noble Book in English. So despite all the changes, this remains the litmus test and also the benchmark for it. But in looking at the revised edition, one Muslim reviewer, Imad Ahmed, said he didn't recognize Yusuf Ali, and he couldn't figure out why the name was Yusuf Ali, but the tone was not. And he went back and he said, I think that when one detranslates, one violates the translation. And what has happened in the Saudi version of Yusuf Ali is the word God has been detranslated back to Allah. In other words, it was translated by Yusuf Ali from Allah to God, but in the Saudi version it was detranslated from God to Allah. And I look far and wide, I would welcome any response from anybody in this audience about any commentary on the reasons for this change. I have looked high and low, I've searched the net, I've also had human resources, not electronic ones. I found nobody who can provide me with a commentary of why this detranslation was made. But it is so thorough that it muffles Yusuf Ali's own labor and his intent. So one has to look elsewhere at different sites to find out what he really meant. And the one site that does it is called Sacred Texts, sacred-text.com. So if you want to say, I've now heard about this other one that's not Yusuf Ali, although he uses his name, and very quick to that, because I skipped this in my paper, I bet you. The reason why you don't have it, because Yusuf Ali did not himself have a commitment about who could reproduce or not reproduce his. So it was in open domain. He was not able himself and did not produce anything like a document that prohibited from being used by others. So when something like that is in the open market, it can be and has been used, as I mentioned, by the Saudi translators who used it before they then shifted to the Khan and Hilali translation, which of course is now the one sponsored from Saudi Arabia. So I want to conclude my remarks by just saying that one must come back, as I find myself doing, to the notion of what did Yusuf Ali mean, and do we honor or dishonor him by changing, by tampering, and shifting his translation. So, for instance, in the Khan Hilali translation, which is the one which you'll now find if you look at any Saudi website or anything that comes from Amman or anything that's related to the current approved translation, you will find no date from Medina Munawwara, but something that says the translations of the meanings of the Noble Quran in English language, and there are echoes of Yusuf Ali, but this is the translation. This is, for those of you who know it, you won't be surprised to hear. For those of you who haven't heard it, you may be, after all these other translations, be a little bit surprised to hear. This is the translation from Khan and Hilali, of Surah Al-Haq. I'm just focusing on this one surah. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. By the full moon after sunrise, by the night when it darkens and stands still, your Lord, and then in parentheses, your Lord, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, has neither forsaken nor hates you. I just have to emphasize that hates. Allah is not hating. I'm sorry, I don't want to go into Arabic, but this is also something that comes up very much in the Pickfeld translation, but it's not Yusuf Ali. Despise. To me, there's a difference between despise and hate. That's another question. And then Jesus goes on, the hereafter is better for you than the present life. Verily your Lord will give you all good, so you shall be well pleased. And then in a series of questions and answers that I focused on so far and want you to remember from my talk, these are the series of question and answers provided in the Khan and Hilali translation of Surah Al-Haq. Did he not find you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, an orphan and give you refuge? And this is the other one. And found you unaware of the Quran, his laws, and prophethood, and guidance. And he found you poor and made you rich, self-sufficient with self-contentment. And then finally, therefore the answer. Treat not the orphan with oppression, repulse not the beggar, and proclaim the grace of your Lord. And then in parentheses, that is to say, the prophethood and all other graces. Now, I want to be generous and not carping, but I have to say, apart from the literary challenge of this particular translation, I'm reminded what was said by Imam Ghazali, that when one does not know the intention of the speaker, it is much better to allow all possibilities instead of proposing them with one translation or with one interpretation, which is what we find in the Khan Hilali. So let me rest my case and end this lecture by just saying that despite what has been done to change, detranslate, and in some ways detract from the original of Abdullah Yusuf Ali and his effort to make English into an Islamic language and the Quran as centerpiece, let me not go back to Judge Murphy, although I will never forget my encounter with him, but let me instead share with you something from my own students. I teach, I've been privileged to teach a number of students who are both Muslim and non-Muslim, but sometimes I have private sessions with my Muslim students, and they come from everywhere. Some even come from America, but many from the Middle East or from South Asia. And I always say to them, come on, tell me now, what is your favorite English translation of the Holy Quran? And you won't be surprised to know that 80 to 90% say Yusuf Ali. And so then I press them further and I say, well, tell me, is it better to translate Allah into God or to leave Allah as Allah? And again, the dominant response from almost all my students is something to the effect of, Allah is the Lord of the universe. But in English, He's also, quote, God, the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds. God, the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds. So for those of you who know your Yusuf Ali, you recognize it. This phrase is Yusuf Ali's distinctive way of rendering Rabb al-Alameen. He translates Rabb al-Alameen as God, the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds. And this is the translation that he chose in 1934. And if you go online to Sacred Texts or even to WikiLibs, you can see it there, and you can learn more about Abdullah Yusuf Ali and appreciate his logic as also his devotion to truth. Thank you.